comparative literature is traditionally started out interlanguage, so like comparing Russian, German, and French, but then over time it's become kind of a more interdisciplinary humanities field. So I kind of mix art history, philosophy, literature, comparative religion, and I'm interested in talking about the rise of the planetary, spiritual, visionary counterculture, of which we are all a part by being here. A bit about me, I went to Bard College as an undergraduate and then went straight into the University of Pennsylvania for my graduate program. And I studied literature and philosophy at Bard, and as I said, comparative literature at Penn. And so when I applied, I didn't know that I could say why I was interested in these topics. I didn't know I could say I wanted to study psychedelics, so I applied with my writing sample was on reading philosophy through fractals, using fractals as a model of understanding different philosophers. And my plan of study was on looking at visionary and mystical poetry. But the reason I wanted to study visionary and mystical poetry was because I identified with what they were saying from my experiences with psychedelics. So why psychedelics? I included here my discharge papers from the emergency room. When I was a freshman, I was introduced to LSD. I had no idea what it was, and I got overexcited. I took it in a dormitory across the room from the residents, the RA of the building, so that was a poor decision on my part. But I just thought it was interesting here. I would share. It says, your diagnosis, drug ingestion, LSD, instructions, do not use illegal drugs, just to pass that one on to you. And so I also included a quote from DMT, the Spirit Molecule documentary, which is amazing if you haven't seen it. So I consider myself one of these people. This is Jeremy Narby had this quote. There's a growing number of intellectuals, scientists, artists, movers and shakers, filmmakers, who realize that this stuff is all too interesting to go on keeping it swept under the rug. At this point, there is no good reason, apart from bad habit, to keep up these barriers. And then, I realized that I was not the only one who was interested in these topics. So at first, the first thing that happened was I read a New York Times article about the MAPS conference in San Jose in 2010. And it was such a positive article, I was really amazed. And then I heard that there was, I live in Philadelphia, I heard that there was a conference, a psychedelics conference in New York City called Horizons. And I went to Horizons, and that was about a year ago, and at that moment I knew exactly what I was doing with the rest of my life. So, but what was interesting about these conferences, Horizons especially, is that the focus, there was this discourse going on of, this time we have to do it right. We can't be like Timothy Leary and the pranksters. We have to be serious. And it was almost like this overcompensation, because it wasn't just, we can't, it was like these scientists knew that they needed to be responsible, and because it's like that they are being watched, you know, and so I completely understand that. But at the same time, there's limits to what science can do and say about these experiences. So there was someone talked about a study at Johns Hopkins at that conference saying that, you know, a certain percentage of the people who had psilocybin had a mystical experience. And Eric Davis, who was there, he stood up afterwards and said, well, yeah, we knew that. That's not like new information. That's, you know, a materialization, secularization of a fact that was already, you know, we've known since the 60s. So he said, the research model is not sufficient. Neurology is on a collision course with the full-on psychedelic experience. And that same weekend, actually, upstate at COSM, the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, Alex and Allison Gray's place, there was a premiere screening of the Spirit Molecule documentary. And Rick Strassman was there. He's the one who pioneered the original DMT study. And he said, how to explicate the full meaning of the psychedelic experience in this current wave of interest in studying these drugs again. I don't think that we can solely depend on psychiatry to be the leader in discussing how these drugs work and their effect and their application to everyday life. I think it has to be as multidisciplinary as a pursuit as possible, because the full psychedelic experience impacts on everything. It impacts on art, anthropology, music, religion, cosmology, physics, psychology, cognitive sciences, chemistry, everything. We don't want to overextend one discipline at the expense of the others. So earlier today, there was a mention of, Ray Thorpe said, the answer is to infiltrate. So my talk today is about infiltrating the academy with psychedelics, and not just in science, but using this wave of the psychedelic renaissance in science research as an excuse to bring up these cultural questions that have been lying under the carpet for decades now. One way that I want to do this is by using the precedent of queer studies to base psychedelic studies upon. Because queer does not refer to just homosexuality. So as these quotes say, queer, the first one, queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence. Queer, then, demarcates not a positivity, but a positionality vis-a-vis the normative. And the second quote, queer studies explores all kinds of difference. It's an interdisciplinary concentration that pulls courses from a variety of fields, does not focus solely on the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. The program's focus is broader on norms and how they've changed over time and throughout different cultures. Psychedelia is already queer. It's a non-normative perspective on consciousness, so it's the queering of consciousness. And the parallels are manifold here, because there's the issue of identity in the first place, in the sense that I know a lot of people who consider their psychedelic experiences and religious beliefs, etc., to be central to who they are. It's not just a thing they do on the weekends. It's part of their identity. And they're persecuted for it, just the way that people are persecuted for having non-normative sexual preferences. And so there's that element to it. And then there's also the theoretical side, the non-normative approach to describing reality. So the queer studies issue came up especially recently in regards to the most recent Horizons conference. So I brought my students in this class. I'm teaching Poetic Vision and the Psychedelic Experience. So these are some of my students here in the main book that I'm teaching. And the book is really interesting because it's comparing the psychedelic experience to visionary poetry and talking about common themes like transcending the ego and a sense of timelessness and the interconnection of all things. And so it's not about the drugs. So just like queer studies isn't just about homosexuality, psychedelic studies doesn't have to just be about taking drugs. It's about the range and potentials of consciousness itself. So, but I originally had applied to have funding for my students to come. I got additional funding from somewhere else, but I applied to the undergraduate academic programs director of the school, and he said, I'm afraid I have to decline to provide funding for this activity, which is completely understandable. There's no money around anywhere, so it's like I wasn't surprised about that. But the next sentence, what I had imagined was an academic conference on hallucinogens or on the psychedelic movement, seemed from the website to be more advocacy than critical reflection. Although I do not want to impede the critical work you want to lead your students to undertake on a fraught subject, it's not evident to me how the conference supports it. And I was super confused about this because the entire point of Horizons was to have a legitimately academic conference on this subject. And I have a quote here from the website talking about the dedicated researchers and scholars. And this is this year's lineup here, and I highlighted it for you. We have PhD, PhD, attorney, PhD, PhD, MD, PhD, PhD. The only person who doesn't have a degree here is the New York Times art critic. So it's not as if this is just a bunch of heads standing around talking about like, oh, last weekend was amazing, let's all get high. But so I posed it because it occurred to me that the dean might have responded the same way if I had been applying for going to a queer studies conference and he was out of touch with queer studies. And because just because a queer studies conference might include people who don't doubt the ability of the field to exist. It doesn't mean that it's advocating a queer lifestyle. So I was fuming about this on Facebook because I was really upset about it. And a friend of mine wrote, a queer studies conference would have a strong focus on state and social repression and the specific oppression suffered by queer people, which is hardly glorifying. And queer identity is not a lifestyle choice in the same way that psychedelics are. But I find this argument to be very problematic because, first of all, it's privileging certain identities over others. It's privileging an idea of free will, being that somehow if you are gay, that's like something that you can legitimize because it wasn't something that you chose, but psychedelics was something you chose. You know, like I might have chosen to take acid in college, but I didn't know what I was getting myself into, and I certainly haven't chosen to not be able to forget it. It's just embedded itself into my entire way of thinking about the world. So, and I just feel like the important thing is to become more open and accepting of different kinds of identities and interests and preferences. And so I just included some, I published on Reality Sandwich my Declaration of Psychedelic Studies article, and I had some feedback. One person said, "Thank you for encouraging me to get out of the closet in terms of what my real interests are in academia." And someone else said, "Reading your article has been something similar to the epiphany you had after attending Horizons. Not unlike the many epiphanies we have all had with psychedelics. Beautiful, fantastically terrifying, and inspiring, all at the same time." And then the last one, "I just read your article, revelatory. My background is in the twitchy world of art theory, and ever since I discovered psychedelics and had my turn, I found myself growing further and further from my familiar and comfortable upbringing under the gilded wings of Deleuze, Heidegger, and Derrida. Now in their stead, I found myself reading figures like McKenna, Starhawk, and Dale Pendle, and I thought, whoa, there goes my future in academia. How naive of me. Of course there are others out there. Thank you for opening my gummy eyes." And so part of what I'm doing is that this is not my idea. It's like the time is right for this to be happening. And I'm just trying to be as vocal as possible so that the people who are meant to be a part of this movement know that it's happening and can come together and be a part of it. And so some further feedback. Separately, I received these messages, people saying, wow, yeah, no, I've thought about the similarity between queer studies and psychedelics before, and both of these people suggested starting a peer-reviewed journal on psychedelic studies, and that's part of how fields are legitimized in academia, is by having like peer-reviewed journals and conferences and things like that. And so the other thing is after the MAPS conference in California a year ago, Catalyst, it's different from the San Jose conference. Jim Fadiman was there. He's a transpersonal psychologist, and he gave a talk. And afterwards, I and several other graduate students separately went up to him and said, "We study these things, and there's no one to mentor and support us." And we were asking for his help. And after he had several people come up to him, he was like, "Well, maybe I should put these people in touch with each other." And so they started MAPS graduate student listserv. So all of a sudden, all of the graduate students working across the disciplines on psychedelics were able to communicate and collaborate. And so this is just currently the represented disciplines. And it's not very loudly advertised, so it's not everyone. But the people who are part of it now includes academic psychiatry, anthropology, clinical psychology, comparative literature, divinity studies, East-West psychology, German, neuropharmacology, and transpersonal psychology. So interdisciplinarity is something that academia often talks about, but falls short of realizing. And this is a radically interdisciplinary field. You cannot start to talk about psychedelics without addressing it from multiple perspectives. So my personal contribution to this field has to do with the philosophical and cultural sides of things. So I was personally interested in the way that hyperspace was being used by people in the DMT community to describe their experiences that were radically different from the experiences of consensus reality. So hyperspace was used as a framing mechanism. So even if it's not real in itself in some objective sense, like it was doing something. And so I started looking into it, and I was wondering where this term hyperspace came from, because it seemed like it was always already being used by Terence McKenna, to describe the DMT experience. But as I looked back, I found out that hyperspace has a very interesting and complex past. There was around 1858, I think there was the first mathematical paper published on looking at the possibility of a higher dimensional space. And about 50 years later, there was a paper published on seeing time as the fourth dimension. So, and as soon as these ideas started circulating, they were picked up by artists and philosophers and people who use that metaphor to describe ways of looking at reality beyond just what we can see. And so up in the corner here, I have the fourth dimension as time kind of thing, where you see all these different phases of this person's life, baby, middle age, to old age and dying. But if you picture it from like the fourth dimension, that's kind of one continuous worm that all of those individual moments are a part of. And the painting here is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. And so it's like a fourth dimensional painting of this person, because it's moving through all these different points of time. So, and ultimately, what one of my core interests is in bringing thought experiments back into academia, because we shouldn't be threatened by ideas that seem far out. You know, like hyperspace shouldn't be something that is, you know, someone talking about higher dimensions of reality, that shouldn't be something that we look at someone and say like, oh, you're crazy. We should be able to, you know, entertain ideas, because we really don't know everything that's going on. Terence McKenna once said, he quoted someone saying, reality might not just be stranger than we suppose, it might be stranger than we can suppose. So Rick Strassman, who did the DMT study, as he was listening to his patients come back from these experiences, he decided, this is the first quote here, the only explanatory model that held itself out as the most intuitively satisfying, yet the most theoretically treacherous, involved assigning a parallel level of reality to these experiences. In other words, I engaged in a thought experiment. I had to accept the reports as descriptions of things that were real. I allowed myself, at least theoretically, to accept that under the influence of DMT, these things do happen in reality, although not in a reality we usually inhabit. And so this goes along with Terence McKenna's idea of intellectual anarchy. He says, I would prefer a kind of intellectual anarchy where whatever was pragmatically applicable was brought to bear on any situation, where belief was understood to be a self-limiting function. So if we understand language to be more than just the surface level meaning of things, then we can actually start to investigate possibilities that are, you know, beyond our current modes of understanding. As Rich Doyle says, dreams do not lack reality. They are real patterns of information. They are saying something, even if that something interpreted in the way we are used to interpreting things doesn't make sense. They're still saying something. So, you know, Albert Einstein thought experiments were important to his way of thinking about things. And then here, the last person I have is Alfred Jarry. And Jarry came up with this idea of pataphysics. And pataphysics is it examines the laws governing exceptions. And it's supposed to be playful. He said, pataphysics should be as far away from metaphysics as metaphysics is from reality, with kind of a joke being that metaphysics is really abstract from what's going on in the real world. But this idea came out of it, of pataphor. So there's metaphor, but pataphor is an extended metaphor that creates its own context. When an idea takes on a life of its own, an assumption based on assumptions. Oh, here I have this painting, this picture of this hand. It's a drawing of a hand, but then suddenly the hand is the drawing. So it's like the drawing takes on a life of its own. And so it gives us a way from within like literary theory of articulating experiences of hyperspace or whatever that you can't really talk about from a scientific perspective without being completely crazy. It's like we're able to like think about from a literary perspective, well, what are the internal possibilities of an idea like hyperspace? What could that do for us? Where can we get by thinking things through in this way? So an example of, we have non-figurative language. The old tree's branches scratched against the window. Then the metaphor would be, the old tree's branches were long fingers scratching at the window. But then the pataphor would be, the old tree's branches were long fingers scratching at the window. When no one responded, it left a note at the door. The idea being that the fingers are now taken literally, and so it's a next step beyond that. So in string theory, it says, because string theory is speculation based on ideas that are themselves speculative, quantum calculations are increasingly not describing an actual reality, but are mathematical pataphors. And so there's an intellectual significance in exploring possibilities for their own sake without needing to already determine that they are somehow the only way of thinking of things. So there's that, as I said, the patterns of information inside the dreams being worthwhile for studying in themselves. But then there's this other possibility of maybe we are actually evolving into higher dimensional beings. So here I have Grant Morrison's Super Gods. Grant Morrison is one of the most prolific comic book writers. He's worked on X-Men, Superman, but he wrote The Invisibles specifically after he had this experience in Kathmandu where he was taken out of his body and communicated with these, from his perspective, like fifth dimensional beings who told him about how time is designed to grow larvae. So it's like his idea being that none of us are born yet. We are higher dimensional beings in the process of gestation. And we're getting to a point now where we're coming into our higher dimensional selves. And so, as I said, there's the perspective that even if this isn't true, there's still something that we can learn from considering our ways of thinking this through. But then what if this is true? What if this is happening? It would be foolish to not consider that possibility just because it doesn't jive with what we currently think about the world. So I have this just short film that was released a few months ago that talks about this issue.
2, 1, 0.
I am very much an optimist. I'm reminded of Rich Doyle's line from Darwin's Pharmacy. He says, dreams do not lack reality. They are real patterns of information. When the Imaginary Foundation says that the role of human imagination is to conceive of all these delightful futures, choose the most amazing and exciting and ecstatic possibility, and then pull the present forward to meet it. That is what we do. We bring our imaginings into existence. But I think that as technology has advanced, we have found ways to outsource our mental capacities to our tools so much more. Our ability to manipulate the physical world has increased in an exponential fashion. So we've been able to shrink the lag time between our imaginings and their instantiation in the real world. David Deutsch speaks in his new book, The Beginning of Infinity. He says, if you look at the topography of the island of Manhattan today, that topography is a topography in which the forces of economics and culture and human intent have trumped the forces of geology. I mean, the topography of Manhattan today is no longer shaped by mere geology. It's shaped by the human mind and by economics and by culture. So what David Deutsch extrapolates is that ultimately that will be the fate of the whole universe. He says gravitation and antimatter might only shape the universe at its earliest and least interesting stages, but eventually the whole entire thing will be subject to the intent of substrate-independent, infinitely more powerful minds. And to conceive of that just, it makes me feel ecstatic.
So there's the, literal, like we're transcending into higher dimensional beings perspective, but there's also a more modest recognition of our collective, co-creating, intentional powers in manifesting reality. And so the visionary planetary culture is super significant here, because first of all, visionary art offers a radically different paradigm to that of ironic postmodernism, because it's not trying to tear things down, it's constructing, it's like ways of seeing. You look at these pieces and it's like you're introduced to, you're becoming part of this other like perspective, this other dimension of reality just by interacting with that art piece. And then we have the participatory events like Burning Man and Rainbow Gatherings, where it's these collective art happenings. I mean, like this, this would be an example of the same principles of people coming together, sharing, creating art, and making something really beautiful out of that. And these are laboratories for possible societies, like the Occupy movement. It's like a laboratory for different ways of relating to each other as communities. And so lastly, bringing all this stuff into Western philosophy, because I majored in philosophy. That's kind of the tradition I was trained in. Bringing it into, so here we have Marshall McLuhan. He's a media theorist. He said, the discovery of the 20th century is the discovery of the process of insight itself, the technique of avoiding the automatic closure of involuntary fixing of attitudes that so easily results from any given cultural situation. The technique of open field perception is a method of organized ignorance, the means of abstracting oneself from the bias and consequences of one's own culture. The technique of the suspended judgment means not the willingness to admit other points of view, but the technique of how not to have a point of view. And so the idea being that we're learning to see where we're projecting beliefs, because the other quote by Jacques Derrida, the future can only be anticipated in the form of an absolute danger. It is that which breaks absolutely with the constituted normality and can only be proclaimed, presented as a sort of monstrosity. So the idea being that there are things, radically ulterior things, that we have not remotely experienced before. And if we're only going to interpret things through what we have experienced, we're not going to be able to adapt and adjust quickly enough to meet the future. And so Terence McKenna talks about resetting your operating system. So just being aware of how we construct the process of system formation itself. So here I have these pictures. The first one is a Lego tank. So it's like, we've gotten to this place with Western civilization. There's all these wars going on. And it seems like the way things are, but it's like, wait a minute. That tank is made out of Legos. What if we could create something different out of those same Legos? What if we could create a new thing out of the same basic building blocks? And that's ultimately what Derrida was getting at. He wasn't just interested in tearing things down. He wanted to show that the constructedness of reality meant that we could be consciously constructing reality. So I would just like to thank you all very much for having me here. And I really like to connect with people. That's my whole project right now. And so my Facebook is facebook.com/fractals. That's my personal page. And then I have facebook.com/psychedelic studies. That's for this, discipline. And then I also have a ongoing psychedelics news column on Reality Sandwich, where I keep track of how psychedelics are being talked about in the news and then kind of compile the links together. So if you're interested in that, it's facebook.com/psychedelic news. So thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you more over the weekend.
One thing that occurred to me, Neşe, was that I guess in the non-humanities sector, in the academic sector, then potentially the use for psychedelics at the moment is, or the way of infiltrating is to use psychedelics as a model or as a mirror or as a tool to shed light on the way the brain works, for example, or sort of other aspects of the organism. So, I mean, can you see that applying in the humanities and the arts and the cultural approach as well? Academics are very scared usually of the ineffable, something they can't explain or something they can't measure. So, how can you see a way around that to sort of slip it into by stealth, I guess, and then perhaps bring some legitimacy to that realm?
Well, part of why psychedelics are so interesting, and Terence McKenna really gets at a lot of these issues, is because it touches at the core of how we construct narratives of reality. And so when you recognize that we're never getting at it, and there's more out there than we can ever describe, then you start to realize that maybe positivism, maybe the idea that only things that we can see and measure exist, is as much of a fantasy projection as any other narrative. And so I think it brings up those topics for conversation. And I feel like there's also more, just because of how long postmodernism has kind of had its tired hold on the academy, like there is this kind of turn towards maybe less absolutely secular and absolutely ironic perspectives. And especially so when I was saying to be able to entertain ideas of things that are not just the here and now without committing yourself to them, just exploring them as possibilities, I feel like that's something that is like really healthy to do, and ultimately is at the heart of all intellectual inquiries. It's not supposed to be like we just go after things that we can already describe and already explain, but we should be able to understand how we know things in the first place, and understanding our process of constructing knowledge, then approach things that we don't understand yet and have no current model for explaining. So I think it does bring all of those issues into the conversation, and that's why it's not just about the drugs. The drugs are an excuse. The psychedelic renaissance is an excuse to bring up these topics and have these conversations. And so I just want to make as much of take this opportunity as best I can and bring up these conversations and encourage other people to bring up these conversations as well. Because a lot of people don't realize that they can work on this stuff and study this stuff in universities. And the thing is, you really can. And you can point to these precedents as justifications, and you can say, this is something that's happening. This is something that's fresh and new, and it's the up and coming thing. And the more people that do it, the more legitimacy it will have. And the more we can actually explore the nature of reality in a dynamic, changing way.
I just wanted to agree with you basically about both the multidisciplinarity of this field, which is just great. Like, you held my attention as a science student, even though it was really, humanities based, and I found that really refreshing, not to have the dichotomy between the two that is common in my experience. But also just to thank you for bring up the whole academic and intellectual honesty sort of thing, because I actually wish that I heard you speak before I spent 3 years not really knowing what I was doing at university, and I wish I just sort of came out and said to people, I want to study psychoactive drugs, and that would have saved me a lot of fiddling around, so to speak. So yeah, I just want to really encourage people to be honest with what they want to get out of their education, and that will just really help this cause.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's definitely not too late for anyone. And I mean, there's so many people who go to college and they're not really into it, and they're there because their parents want them to be. And this is something that's super, super important and super interesting. And so I think just becoming aware of this as something that you can study from any disciplinary perspective, anthropology, philosophy, history, art history, You know, it's something that you can take whatever your interests are and actually incorporate it and come up with something new and something that's actually helping the world evolve in a positive direction. So definitely infinite encouragement to anyone who's vaguely interested in this to pursue it further.
Thanks very much again, Neşe. Fantastic.